Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. How are we, Josh? I know you noticed I mixed it up a little there in the beginning.
Yeah, no, I like it. Keep me on my toes. I'm excited, I guess.
Well, you got to have a hobby. So today I think we're going to join into the discussion that everyone else in the country is having, for the most part today, from the perspective of Texas, and talk about what is going to happen with the Supreme Court in the aftermath of the sad death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I want to focus really on the looming battle over Ginsburg's replacement from the perspective of public opinion in Texas. And I think we ought to really think about this even less in terms of the in and out of the choice before the Senate and before the country, and start really with the perspective of what Texans have thought about the Supreme Court in the context of elections. So, it's a well-rehearsed point now that national election polls going into 2016 showed that a large share of Republican voters said that the Supreme Court appointments were an important factor, and many the most important factor influencing their presidential vote. And when we were in the field in October of 2016, we saw something similar in Texas.
Yeah, that's right. So in our October election poll that year, we asked voters to tell us, from a list of sort of the main issues that were being discussed in that time, including, the economy, immigration, foreign policy, healthcare, education, and also nominating justices to the Supreme Court, among others, what the most important issue is for them in their vote choice. And at the time, we found that 25% of Texans said that nominating justices to the Supreme Court was the most important issue for them. So 1 in 4 voters. And that was the plurality of opinions. So no other issue passed it. Among Republicans, that share jumped up to 33%. So almost 1 in 3 Republicans said it was the most important issue in their vote, compared to 19% of Democrats, who were split between that and the economy. So still an important issue for Democrats, but not necessarily rising to the level that we saw amongst conservatives in that polling, and then also in exit polling as well.
And at the time, I think we noticed that, and Donald Trump had, and other Republicans had made that part of the campaign. So the question is now, do you think that pattern holds?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
And how do you know?
Right, right. Yeah, no, I mean, that seems to be a lot of the discussion in the sort of the immediate discussion here is, I think you could probably pretty easily just search the web and find, a list of articles on either side saying how this is or is not going to mobilize either Democrats or Republicans, depending on the writer. And sometimes, depending on the piece, you see the case made for both, that this is going to be a mobilizing issue for both sides. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I guess it's ultimately, one of those things, because I mean, the thing about this, I mean, just to sort of kick this off, is ultimately, I'm not a big fan of these types of questions. I mean, we asked it here, and I'm not a big fan of these types of questions, ultimately because people are actually pretty bad at telling you their motivations for doing things. And this isn't just politics. This is in general. So ultimately, when someone says, my vote choice is based on the Supreme Court vacancy, it's like, well, are you a Republican? It's like, yeah. Okay. Do you vote normally? Yes, I do. Do you always vote for Republicans? Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that it's because of the Supreme Court vacancy. It's probably because you're a Republican, right? So I think that all these kinds of, explanations and ideas out there need to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt in terms of, is it shifting opinion or changing people's choices? Now, does it mobilize people?
See, and I think that's probably the more important question.
That is the more important question, right? And so I think that's one of the things that is sort of the first piece of this. I don't see this as being a big game changer in terms of maybe how people vote, But I mean, is this something that's going to, fan the partisan flames and really, increase the urgency amongst some people to vote? I think that's fair. And I think that's probably true on both sides. Don't you?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it comes out in the wash. I mean, in terms of, might we see some very incremental increase in mobilization on this issue because of this? Possibly, but I think we're already looking at a pretty high voter turnout despite all the things that are going to make it difficult to go vote. Like if you're an older person, you could get fatally ill. I think this is now, it's sort of baked into the partisanship. I mean, I think the question is here, who gets more of a ramp up in intensity on this? And the intensity is so ramped up. I mean, in our last poll in June, and this has not gone down, Donald Trump's disapproval among Democrats was 93%. You can't get 93% of Democrats to agree on anything.
And also,
but they will agree on the fact that they hate Donald Trump. And within that, the strongly disagree was, high 80s?
High 80s, something in that range. And approval
And on the flip side, go ahead. On the flip side, approval for Trump is also pretty strong.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, the thing about this is, I mean, needless to say, this is a huge event. And it's a huge event partially because I think anytime you replace the Supreme Court justice is a big event in sort of just the political space. I think, the thing that people are focusing on, and we can kind of move towards this discussion, is the process by which that replacement happens, right? And that's kind of, I think, where the quote unquote smart people are thinking about the impact of the process. But the thing is that, ultimately,
what share of the electorate would you say is smart people?
I'm not going to answer that question.
I just know you're in a little bit of mood because you're homeschooling, and so
man.
You never know when I'm just going to get an answer from you.
No, I'm not going to do that. But I mean, the thing I would think is, if you're thinking about this in terms of, again, as a mobilization effort, it probably, as I'm sitting here thinking about, it probably does help Republicans a little bit more than Democrats, I think. And I think, but marginally. And that's the thing here, right? Ultimately, if you're the type of Democrat who's a big Ruth Bader Ginsburg fan, odds are you were voting and you were going to vote for Joe Biden. I mean, that's a pretty safe bet. There's not going to be a lot of sort of pro-Ginsburg
Trump crossover.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of that going on. So ultimately, if this is a big issue for you, the issues that, are on the table now because of a changed composition of the court, and if you're thinking about those kinds of issues, you probably know how you're going to vote. I think, the extent that, it might be a little bit more helpful for Republicans, and I'm only really talking at the margins here. I think the idea here would be that if you are a Republican who has reservations about Donald Trump, and the important point here that you've already made with our job approval numbers is that's not a huge share of Republicans. It's a very small share of Republicans, but for whom a conservative majority on the court is very important. Well, maybe this pushes you in the direction of sort of reaffirming that vote choice. Now, having said that, I could also make the case that, hey, if they put a replacement on the court before the election even, now again, I think they'll do it after the election, you could say what difference does it make? But I think, again, at the margins here, at the margins of maybe some satisfied Republicans, maybe this is helpful.
Yeah. And that math, it's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down to, but it is an interesting one that if those people are also the same people that are aware of the process intricacies and choices here, it could avoid, you could have your cake and eat it too. You could vote for Joe Biden and then go, yeah, but I'm still going to get a conservative justice. But what I'm really locked up in right now is thinking about that people that are Ginsburg and Trump fans. I'm imagining somebody looking at their hat rack and going, should I wear my Notorious RBG or should I wear my
Make America Great Again
today? I'm not sure.
I've got some weird speculations running through my head right now.
It's
well, there's another dimension. I'd be like, can I ask you how you feel about our relationship with Israel?
There's going to be a very odd, that's going to be at the intersection of some very odd recombinant attitudes. I would hazard a guess to say they're independent voters. I would say this, that the other way that I think, and I think this is also a marginal advantage, but one, I think, way that this does advantage Republicans is in media sort of media attention and, agenda space and just public attention bandwidth.
Yeah.
Because I think it is an advantage for Republicans at the presidential level, and I think it's going to vary probably at the sub-presidential level. It's going to differ in different states, and it's particularly going to be different in different districts. But say congressional or in Texas state legislative districts, and this is a little oversimplified, but I think it's still right that Republicans would much rather be talking about this, even with all the charges of hypocrisy and the Lindsey Graham videos and whatever, than talking about the pandemic and the response to the pandemic as the deaths keep rolling up. And as we are getting some indications that in some places we're getting a little bit of ramping up again.
Well, and
so
also,
I just think it's a better issue for Republicans than talking about pandemic response or the economy.
Yeah, and to link that back up to what I said at the beginning about not being a big fan of these sort of kind of these sorts of questions that ask well, what was the deciding factor in your vote, or what was the major issue? But what those items often do reflect is they do reflect proximity, and I would say they reflect the salience of the conversation. So ultimately, what I think you saw there was when Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell decided that he wasn't going to hold a vote on Barack Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, until after the 2016 election, what he was signaling was, hey, the Supreme Court's a big issue in this election.
Right.
And I think we picked that up in our voting. Now, whether people were voting particularly because of that issue or not, I think is an open question. But ultimately, it tells you what became, I think, sort of what we say is like what the election was about for a large number of people.
And this time is a lot noisier.
This time's a lot noisier, right? There's
and
a lot
Donald Trump and there's an incumbent.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, that complicates all those things. But I think that's sort of, again, I agree with you. I mean, ultimately here, I think, Republicans at this point would much rather be having a discussion about, the process even the process of replacing a Supreme Court nominee than they would be about 200,000 coronavirus deaths and 30 million unemployed.
Your average viewer is going to glaze over after 5 minutes of the process discussion anyway. So, I think another interesting aspect of all this is a little wonkier, but I think ultimately comes back to the moment we're in. And that's the place of the Supreme Court in Texas in thinking about federal institutions and the U.S. government and this really pregnant issue of trust in government and declining trust in government and institutions. And, we've done, luckily for us, and for the state of Texas, a lot of polling on this where we've asked people, what branch of government do you trust the most? And we've been doing this since 2012. And so this is one of those issues where we have the benefit of having seen both changes in the presidency and changes in control of Congress and developments across the court.
Right. I mean,
and
and the composition of the court, really.
Well, I think interestingly for the Supreme Court discussion right now, shifts within the apparent orientation of the court itself, or at least some of the justices. I mean, no need being coy about it. John Roberts' position is what's kind of key in this. And so, if you go back, the patterns are pretty clear, right? I mean, they're complicated, but they're clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think for this discussion, the most important thing here to note is, you saw an uptick, as I recall, an uptick in trust in the court amongst Republicans as, basically more Republican appointees were making their way onto the courts. But then you saw a pretty steep decline once, a Roberts-led majority, who was appointed by George W. Bush, upholding the ACA, right?
And approving the constitutionality of gay marriage,
right? And so those two issues, I think, pretty much instantly led to a fair amount of skepticism, and especially amongst Republicans and conservatives towards the court, right?
Yeah, I mean, just to put some numbers on that. So in October of 2012, when we asked people Texans what the most trusted branch of government was, Supreme Court was the top response, almost half. 45% of Republicans said they trusted the Supreme Court and the judicial branch the most, followed by Congress at 19%, and only 2%, of course, trusted the executive branch with Barack Obama as president. But, the thing that we've always watched in this, and that I think gets us to this issue of trust, is that 34% of Republicans didn't know.
Right.
And really have an answer. So then if you jump to November of 2015, after some of these Supreme Court decisions are getting handed down, and Roberts is taking heat from Republicans, and particularly from the conservative end of the Republican Party, that trust among Republicans in the Supreme Court drops from 45 to 23%. Congress gets a little bit of a hit, and remember that at that point there was a Republican majority in both houses. So it goes to trust in the Congress being the most trusted branch goes from 19 to 30%. But at that point, 45% of Republicans, almost half, say that they don't know. So that increases 11%.
And I should say that's a meaningful response in this case, we think. I mean, partially because it's reacting to clear markers in the political environment, and then in ways that make sense. And so sometimes a don't know just means, I don't know. And sometimes don't know means this is a I don't trust any of these in most cases, or I can't even pick out of these which one I trust the most, which I think in and of itself is telling. And I think in the environment that we're in right now, this question about institutional trust is really important. So we saw this decline in trust in the court amongst Republicans relative, again, to the other branches, which is important here, I think. But assuming that the Republican majority in the Senate pushes through Trump's nominee during the lame duck session, potentially with, potentially they could have lost the presidency coming up. Potentially they could lose the Senate in that period, and they could still move a nominee forward. Whether that happens or not is, I think, kind of irrelevant to this point. But if they move a nominee through especially during that lame duck session, you're going to see Democratic trust in the courts, basically fall off a cliff to the extent that it existed. And we were talking about this a little bit before, and I related it to some of our items on race and discrimination, where, there's a couple ways to look at that stuff, and you could kind of cut, that data by thinking, about which groups see, blacks as the most discriminated against group in a society versus Christians versus white. But there's another way to look at all that data and say, geez, there's a heck of a lot of discrimination floating around, and everybody sees it. They may not think it's the same groups, but ultimately there's a discrimination problem actually above and beyond even just, any particular groups, if you take the data at its face. I think, this is another one of those situations where, you look at something like this and you say, what are the enduring costs to trust in, the judiciary, which is supposed to kind of set the rules and be neutral. And again, that's a very simplified version of reality, right?
But it's one that a lot of people have.
But it's one that a lot of people have. And if the process by which, justices, get appointed becomes, overtly political or seems to be overly tainted, there's sort of just a broad systemic problem that arises from that, I think.
Yeah, well, not to go a bridge too far with the implication of that your characterization of the discrimination data, but it brings you back, and you didn't use this term, but I think you could, that there's a lack of social trust, right? Mm-hmm. And so, one could operationalize social trust more specifically than that, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a sign of that, and I want to pick up on something you said before you went into the discrimination comparison. But, one of the interesting things about this notion of, who's trusting how much and how much partisanship, who's trusting what branches, how much partisanship weighs into it, is that after Donald Trump got elected, a lot of Democrats put their trust in the Supreme Court, and I think were heartened by the fact that Roberts led the court, and he did to some degree on the gay rights and the ACA decisions, because if you look at trust in the Supreme Court in 2015 among Democrats, it was 23%, and that's with a Democratic president, right? You go to February 2020, and of course, Democratic trust in the presidency has plummeted to about the level that Republicans had in Obama, 3%, while Republicans' trust in the president has increased to 54%. But Democrats' trust in the judicial branch increased from 23 to 36% between November 2015 and February 2020. And remember, in February of 2020, Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House, so the Democrats still have a House of Congress. Only 24% say they trust Congress the most. Now, of course, it's divided government in Congress. And so
Congress gets kicked around all the time, no matter
there's
what.
There's a Mitch McConnell issue. And, yeah, I mean, people just don't like Congress.
Right.
Even Democrats. The other piece of that, though, in terms of this faith, so 2 points to make about that movement. One, there's still some residue of that sense of trust in the judicial branch, even among partisans, even though it's well known that the court is dominated by conservatives at this point. I mean, this is after Donald Trump is already, this is post Kavanaugh by a while. But the trust problem then transfers in terms of the don't know responses to Democrats. And so 38% in February of 20 of Democrats say they don't know, which we're taking as a surrogate for I really don't trust any of them. So now, if you take those two numbers, I think that actually buttresses the argument for saying that all things are being equal in terms of salience and mobilization. The Democrats are in a different place now than they were in 2016. The court, I mean, this fight is going to be more salient, I think, to Democrats. Now, that may not translate into some big gain in mobilization, but my guess is we're going to see.
Well, it has translated. It's translated. It's translated into fundraising. I mean, that was sort of the most immediate,
which is an interesting indicator.
I think in the 2 hours I read, I think this morning, in the 2 hours sort of after the announcement between 9 and 11, basically, I think some of the various Democratic surrogates raised something like $100,000 a minute during those 2 hour windows. So
there's all kinds of numbers depending on where you drive it, but they raised a lot of money. Yeah,
I would say this. I think the thing is that my feeling about this is that it's going to increase intensity, right? I think, ultimately, but it's probably going to increase intensity mostly amongst the people who already were pretty intense. I mean, for Democrats, this is basically their worst nightmare. I mean, if you're sort of someone who follows this stuff closely as a Democrat, for Republicans, I think this is a big opportunity. And I think, the far side, this kind of relates to public opinion on this and kind of what sort of the questions we should expect to see, over the next couple of weeks. But and then there's this sort of other thing kind of hanging out there, I think, that I would, again, put this kind of in the thing that smart people are, thinking about, but that probably doesn't matter, which is, hypocrisy.
I think we should say smart and interested, to be fair.
Right. That's fair. So smart and interested people are thinking about, thank you. And it's this idea of does the hypocrisy of it matter? And the hypocrisy I'm talking about, is basically the idea of, Obama nominated,
Merrick Garland.
Merrick Garland. Over 200 days before the election, McConnell said, no, too close to the election. We're not going to do that. Obviously, Trump is going to nominate someone, but it sounds like by the end of this week, which will be about, within about 40 some odd days of the election. And McConnell, on the night that, that was announced that Ginsburg had died, said, we're going to hold a vote.
Yeah.
And so for some people, they're saying, the Lindsey Graham comment you point out is, that's the starkest of it all, which is basically say, he basically said, if this situation comes up, you show this clip again, is kind of the, is his piece of it. And there's this idea that somehow, well, does this matter? And, the short answer to my mind is, well, no, because generally hypocrisy doesn't seem to matter too much in politics, although there are limits. And we could come back to that a little bit.
Although the bar seems,
we can talk about
the bar moving.
Well, that's the question we'll come back to. But the further question is
and I don't even mean in this. I just mean generally.
No, I mean that as well. But I think the public opinion question is, again, you're going to see a lot of questions over the next couple of days are going to be trying to, poke at this idea of does the hypocrisy matter, or is this situation different in some fundamental way, so therefore it's not hypocritical or whatever.
Right.
Ultimately, if you think about where we started about, what you asked me not answering, what share of the electorate is smart and interested or whatever.
I was just going with smart.
Great. But if you think about this, one of the things I would say, and I was just writing down some of the questions. First of all, do people even understand this process at all is a fair question here, right? Ultimately, the share of the electorate that understands that a Supreme Court vacancy is filled with a nomination from a president and then advice and consent of the Senate alone, right? That in and of itself is a fair amount of information that a lot of people are probably not really aware of the mechanics. Do they know this recent history that we're talking about? Honestly, odds are probably not. I mean, we were talking about this yesterday, but every year that we have an election, I'm always somewhat shocked, but less and less so, by the extent to which it almost seems like the last election never even happened. I mean, in terms of the way people talk and stuff, and I think that's just almost feels like a constant. So, I mean, one, I don't expect people to know this history. And then with this question of, well, does it matter? Well, I mean, I go back to the thing I said originally about people's motives for voting. Well, maybe it's the margins for a couple people. Again, maybe there are, some, Republicans out there. I mean, maybe there's some Democrats, again, who are Ginsburg Trump voters. Maybe there are, some Republicans out there who say, hey, I don't like what this does to the process, but they're going to be a very, very small share of them. And for most people, their decisions are baked. They're baked into the cake. And for the people who haven't made decisions, it's unlikely that something that's so process driven as this, and so really, very kind of insidery and detailed, is going to be the thing that's going to tip someone one way or the other. At least that's what I think.
Well, I think that's right. And I think that, to be a little less, jokey and loose about this, smart, interested thing, we know that, this is what party identification and what, elite signaling does for people. It fills in the gaps in information that they have about things that are complicated, and both difficult and not that interesting and time consuming to figure out. And they do, in fact, then, look for shortcuts, and partisanship is a shortcut, and, the elite opinion is a shortcut. And in elections, those two things intersect tightly, and they intersect even more tightly now in, such a polarized and ideologically sorted political system.
Yeah. And I mean, so the thing is that, this may not matter, for the election so much, but I mean, take a step back. And this is sort of the discussion we were having yesterday about, the broader implications for the system. I mean, I think the thing that, you and I were kind of marveling at a little bit is, it wasn't too long ago that, you would expect a politician to potentially be constrained, at the very least, by the statements they made themselves recently about what they think should and should not happen, right? I mean, ultimately, I think that's kind of something that we sort of expect from just anyone in communication, that if they tell you, like, well, I would never do this, and then, 2 days later they say, let's do this, you'd say, well, geez, that's a problem, especially for someone, you're elected into a representative position to represent your interests, right? Ultimately, that's a problem. But the extent to which now, it's hard to say that it's not, led by the president in some way, by which, politicians don't feel bound by positions they've taken or statements they've made, even recently. It's sort of setting aside, how you feel about it or what side you come down on it or whatever, it's a pretty troubling thing. Now, some of people, now if you're listening to this, you may say, hey, politicians have been lying forever. It's like, yeah, no, I understand that. I get the whole.
There were bounds.
But there were bounds. I mean, ultimately, yes, you may say that politicians were lying or they're two-faced or whatever. But ultimately, if I have a video of you saying we're doing this thing and this is the rule from now on, and then 4 years later you say, well, nope, that's not the thing, actually.
Yeah, and and I would say that there's some too dangerously close to the edge of some kind of postmodern linguistic thing here. But there is, there's still the shadow of that need. I mean, Lindsey Graham still felt the need to come up with an excuse. Yeah. Right. Well, and his excuse was that the way that they treated that Justice Kavanaugh was treated meant that he was no longer bound by that because the rules are already broken. Ted Cruz, in a very, kind of debate team sort of manner said, well, no, this isn't the same because the parties were different then. And now, it's more democratic because the Senate and the president are of the same party. And so we're just doing what the voters want.
And by the way, if the shoe were on the other foot, this is what they would do. So we're going to do it.
Right. And so, it's interesting. So it's still kind of out there, I think there, another factor is here, I think to some degree, and this is just like, it still makes the point that it's hard not to see as a degradation of public discourse, because you think about applying some of these things to your personal life and it would never work, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that, no, really. I mean, this is just like, and so, I mean, this is part of the degradation of the discourse that we're seeing and of the process. I mean,
well, and that's the thing. And I think, what I think is, and we're in the immediate aftermath of the beginning of this period, right? And I think, the focus is really sort of right now, not incorrectly, I guess, on the immediate. But I mean, as I think what this discussion is kind of crystallizing for me and my thinking about this is that, I think the immediate consequences are limited. I think there'll be some fundraising, there'll be some shift in, let's say, enthusiasm amongst, certain groups of voters, maybe a couple people will switch votes here or there if they had loose intentions to begin with. But the bigger consequences are long term. Now, the obvious long term consequence is the composition of the court's going to change, and that's got its own sort of, discussion that we could have about it. But I mean, but there's this other piece. You started, early on this discussion talking about these trust numbers, and it does raise this question about institutional trust. I mean, trust in, again, both, let's say the courts themselves to be, neutral arbiters on the one hand, the idea that, politicians, though they're politicians, are at the very least going to be, consistent enough, within some kind of broad rubric. That's all important right now. And I think, in a time where I think, when we look at polling, we look at cross polling, you see sort of, increasing distrust in institutions, increasing distrust in politicians, political actors, really all kinds of traditional institutions. There's something about this that's pretty troubling in the long-term big picture health aspect.
Yeah. I mean, talking about things we've talked about before, I mean, this is not going to help the condition in which, the whole idea of rational discourse, fact-based argument, and something resembling truthful validation of things that are being said in the public sphere. This is not going to help this at all. We've seen the degrading of that. And look, I mean, it sounds very partisan, but the bounds of this have been extended by the president. There's no two ways about that. And his willingness to say things that are blatantly untrue and repeat them and not give in until his critics or the fact check just gets exhausted and.
Or deny even having said something.
Right. But so that's all this is all happening within that. And, I was looking at these numbers in trusted branches and thinking about where how I might imagine these results looking depending on different results of the election, different results of this selection process. And look, I think, I will be very surprised if Trump's appointment does not make it to the court, given where we are now. I just don't.
Well,
I just think it's the odds-on outcome. And I don't, there's also, there's an underlying piece of how the system is supposed to work in terms of checks and balances here that is being sorely tested. Mm-hmm. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining, Josh. I know you're busy. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our crew in Liberal Arts ITS, the Liberal Arts Development Studio, for giving once again technical support par excellence and enabling us to do this. All the data that we're talking about can be found at the Texas Politics Project website in our poll archive, and maybe we'll even throw it up in a blog. Keep an eye out. And that is at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening and stay well, and we'll be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.